Welcome everyone back to 2019, and of course we have got Discovery CSI is the new name for the program, where David Hawkins joins me to reverse engineer crime scene investigations, of course based on the technological signature of the crime. David, for many years you've been applying this technique to some of the most sinister crimes in the history of the world, 9/11 and murders of high-value targets. How are you, David? How is 2019 treating you so far?
Well, let's say we're how many days? 2 days in, and I've made it so far. But it's
That's
okay.
good.
Thank you, Jason.
That's good.
Happy New Year.
Well. Yeah, so we're going to embark on this journey. Of course, David, each week on Fridays, usually at 1 p.m. Eastern, you and I are doing a show that is exclusive to our Patreon sponsors. I want to thank all of the generous sponsors who have made 2018 a great year for Crowdsource the Truth. And I want to remind everyone that it's very important that David has our financial support as well. David has joined me to put together this very unique program, and people can go to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards to support David, and of course patreon.com/crowdsource the truth to support the main channel. David, you have been remarkably diplomatic in your review of this Patreon dust-up, which has so many people, including myself, very unhappy. You have proposed this notion that perhaps Patreon does want to do the right thing, but somehow a third party is influencing them and preventing that from happening. Can we talk about that briefly before we get into today's topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, my background is in the development of patentable ideas back to 1980, when I invented the deductive computing machine. So I've always been interested in the power play is probably the wrong word, but how the inventor of an idea who might have applied and paid a great deal of money to secure a patent gets into commercial operation and gets some of the benefits of that patent. And of course, the big problem is when you come up with a powerful idea that is liable to make a great deal of money, you attract the predators. Now, I believe the Patent Office now in the United States is totally controlled by the British intelligence through this company called Serco. And of course, the Patent Office in the States comes under the bailiwick, if you will, of Commerce Secretary, whom you met recently, Wilbur Ross, who claims, which I find totally bizarre, since Serco has just processed in the 15th of November of last year its 4 millionth patent for the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And Trump and Wilbur Ross were boasting about how they processed a total of 10 million. When you asked him the question, what about Serco, he didn't want to talk about it, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad you're bringing this back up, because these are the topics that you and I cover basically each week. But for me at least, it took several rounds of discussing this and listening to you and thinking about it for me to really understand the point and the focus of what you're getting at, because it is very high level, it is very fantastic sounding at first blush, but of course everything that you're saying can be traced back anytime anyone has ever challenged any of the things that you've told me. You always have a path to go back and look at these things. Like, you know, the Patent Office, as you've described it to me, was first controlled by Dr. Thornton, the guy who designed the Capitol building, and he was already scheming and scamming people out of their inventions way back in the day. Perhaps now, David, on our first show in 2019 is a good opportunity to review some of that so new viewers perhaps can be brought up to speed.
Yes, certainly. So Dr. William Thornton became the first superintendent of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He was an Anglo-American. He was the architect, as you say, of the Capitol building, which is a very iconic building, particularly as it appears to have been the target in the Amalgam-Virgo war game of the 1st and 2nd of June of 2001, where they rehearsed 9/11 And in the briefing document on the front page is a picture of Osama bin Laden. So it's a bit, is it disingenuous by the elite intellectuals of the American military and government to say this was a total surprise? It wasn't a surprise. They rehearsed it, right?
Well, not only that, they said that no one could have anticipated. George W. Bush, specifically on television, said that no one could have anticipated this type of attack, but yet we've seen the document Amalgam Virgo, which I've now seen testimony on C-SPAN where that Amalgam Virgo exercise is specifically referenced, which that's the type of thing that, in my view, when you first showed me that document, it was hard to believe the document. This Amalgam Virgo document looks like something somebody just created on their own computer with a goofy picture of Osama bin Laden, and there was no way to know if it was real or fake. But if Congress is speaking about it, that seems to lend quite a bit more credibility to it, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. But your point was, to help listeners who've just joined to understand this technique of going back into the patent office. So
yes.
The inventor of a rifle approached in 1811 Dr. William Thornton and asked if he would issue a patent for the rifle. And I think Thornton told him it's already been invented. It was the Ferguson rifle, which was, I think, a rifle that didn't need people to stand up and present themselves to a sniper. They could actually reload horizontally. And he said, well, it's already been invented, but if you add my name to the patent inventor, I'll grant the patent. Well, I went through somewhat similar circumstances with my deductive computing machine, the priority date being 11/11/1988. I spent a huge amount of money trying to get it patented. I think to this day it's probably the most important patent as a way of qualifying an artificial intelligence expert system or fuzzy logic algorithm. And as you kind of implied at the beginning in your introduction, I've been doing this, 1981, I had the original invention in mind, and it's going to be nearly 40 years. And 1988, I applied in the Europe. Yes, there it is. It makes me quite proud of that because that's where I used to live, 20 St. George's Road. I'm getting so senile that I'd almost forgotten where I live. But look at the priority date. Isn't that an interesting date? Let me just tell you why. 1988 was an interesting year because Serco was structured for an initial public offering to the London Stock Exchange by its investment bankers N.M. Rothschild and Sons. If you look at the shareholding of Serco, and I'll just do a fast forward there, the shareholders of Serco met on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 9/11, hosted, I believe, I can't prove it, by their investment banker, which at that time would have been Wilbur Ross. Right? So when at the next meeting, God willing, you have a chat with Wilbur Ross, maybe on your show, please, Jason, ask him what he was doing on 9/11. Right, because that's a fairly significant figure, right?
Yeah.
And if he doesn't know about Serco and its role in patents that stretches back to the Second World War, A, he should be booted out of his position as Commerce Secretary, or he should be brought before the courts for, I don't know, malfeasance or willful ignorance. Anyway, by the by. So I invented that deductive computing machine, which was a means of looking at the world through a computer program to make sure that the way the world is viewed by the computer program accords with your view of the world, right? So let's say we continue with this stupidity, folly, and fraud of believing that carbon dioxide is a driver of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, when in fact it's a wholly beneficial gas in trace quantities that is odorless and transparent and is a vital part of the fertilizer process, right? So if you take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right, the plants are going to die and they're going to go brown, in which case, as I facetiously or otherwise say, the Green Party is going to have to change its name to the Brown Party, which doesn't have the same cachet, right?
Right.
So going back to that patent, let's take the idea that the patent office has been controlled by British intelligence for, let's say, 200 plus years.
Right.
And British intelligence decided in 1836 that the Americans had quite a useful portfolio, potentially useful portfolio of patents that they might use back in the UK to turbocharge the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. Well, why wouldn't they steal all the patents, the models, and the designs from the patent office and then burn it down? So in 1836, I think it was the name Boggs Hotel or something, the patent office was burnt to the ground. But when the British attacked Washington, they burnt all of the buildings, as I understand it, but someone intervened and said it's a crime against the future to burn the patent office. So the Brits kept it. So was that 1811, I think, when they sacked Washington?
Well, in 1836 is when Wikipedia tells us the patent office fire occurred.
Yeah, but in 1811 or 1812, didn't the British attack Washington?
That's outside of my scope of knowledge. We've heard they burnt down the White House. Yeah, War of 1812.
Yeah, there we go, 1812. But they left the patent office standing. Now, the Brits may have many faults, you see, but they're not dumb. If you've got a bright, energetic, innovative country that's just broken away from the empire in 1776, and everyone's inventing things, and and you're looking into the future, you're saying, hey, these guys are too good to burn down the patent office now. Why don't we give them another 20 years and we'll burn down the office, then, and we'll steal all the patents. Now, can I prove it? No. What I can prove, however, is that if you control the patent office of a country, you control the country. And at the moment, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the National Visa Center, the U.S. Defense Ammunition Center, about 60 FAA contract towers, and various key components of your military communication system, and I believe the Defense Red Switch network, have been captured by Serco.
Right.
And one of the first priorities for an informed government, if Trump is looking, I often use that metaphor, if Trump is hoping to drain the swamp, he needs to locate the plug, and I think you and I can tell him where the plug is. It's Serco and Wilbur Ross.
I think Wilbur Ross is plugging up the drain to the swamp, to tell you the truth, David. It seems like this image is very appropriate for today.
Yeah, Wilbur Ross restructured Trump's debts in 1990. And in fact, I think he was working on it in 1988. So in 1988, Christine Marcy, who was then a 4-year founder of what is now called CONAIR, or the United States Justice, Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, early in December of 1988, she calls her brother, Field McConnell, my erstwhile colleague in Able Danger, who I have great admiration for, but I'm concerned about, because Field told his sister that if there was a mutiny on the plane, all she needed to do was drone the plane, and then, of course, the plane could be landed safely. Now, Christine Marcy, at that time, I believe, she had bought a Boeing, I can never remember whether it's a 727 or 757 or whatever, with money that I believe she'd stolen from the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, which she had founded and was running with Eric Holder, the former Attorney General. Now, the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, it's a funny kind of deal, because if you find someone driving around in a Lamborghini and you don't think, and you're the local sheriff and you don't think that they've got the means to justify driving around in a Lamborghini, apparently under that scheme you can confiscate the Lamborghini, and then the government is sued by the owner of the Lamborghini to prove that he bought it with legitimate funds, or she bought it with legitimate funds. And of course, most people don't want to sue the government, because you basically lose just about everything you got, right? So she has a means of raising an immense amount of money through her administration of the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund. And for example, HSBC, Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation, which is the retail bank for Serco, paid a $1.9 billion fine for laundering money for the drug cartels. and various terrorists and dictators around the world, but not one director of HSBC was arraigned before the courts and put behind bars, right? Because they're aiding and abetting terrorism. And as far as I'm concerned, I think the New York headquarters office of HSBC was on the ground floor of either Tower 1 or Tower 2, which is kind of interesting. So we've got this extraordinary nexus of powerful groups around the Serco IPO of 1988, when I get a priority date for my patent. And what I'm thinking now, Jason, is I can't prove it. I think they looked at my patent and said, hey, this is, incidentally now, it's I think they call it stranded intellectual property, because I ran out of money to implement it, but I implemented it anyway in the various systems that I've been developing since then, including reverse CSI engineering. So it's kind of roundabout way of talking about the patents, but I believe if you can get inside the patent office, or no, correction, if you can capture the patent office and then screen every patent application in America, and Serco has done that for the last 4 million patents, and then classify them, why wouldn't you classify them in terms of their capability in neutralizing the carbon footprint of what you deem to be your enemy? Well, I don't know the forces hidden behind the British government, but you know that federal bridge? We were talking about the UK MOD CCEB,
yes,
which has got apparently on the federal bridge the ultimate route authority over the federal bridge. Well, if you have the route authority for the federal bridge, you control the federal bridge, right? So that CCEB route is down at 7 or 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock, I would say, on that chart that you're showing. You've got UK MOD CCEB, right?
yes.
All right, and that I think is called the Communications Electronics Board, or Central Communications Electronics Board. That's the electronics highway or switchboard for the Five Eyes countries going back to the Second World War. So somehow or other the British, and again I think it's a component of British intelligence and a very corrupt component of British intelligence, has wormed its way into a situation on the Federal Bridge where it controls what gets approved in the patent office and what gets denied, what gets adjusted, what gets manipulated. And I've coined this phrase with the help of a friend, Patentstein, which is a hybrid between Frankenstein and the patent office. And what I'm saying is we've created a system that 99.9% of the public, and certainly most of the politicians, they don't understand. If you program the patent office, or if you embed in the patent office patents that are based on artificial intelligence, expert system, or fuzzy logic algorithms, you've removed the mens rea component of a successful prosecution for murder for hire, because the computer is now going to decide whether someone should live or die. So on 911, one of the characteristic signatures at the crime scene, I sometimes call it or think of it as the dog that didn't bark. There's no empathy between the party executing the crime and the attacks on those individual companies. For example, Cantor Fitzgerald lost 658 people. Now, as that attack progresses, a human being would look at the devastation they're wreaking and say, hey, pull your troops out. Even the most maddened dictator that has deployed a hit team to a foreign country and the hit team starts killing, I mean, the killings are normally focused on an individual high-value target, and it might be the president or the prime minister of the targeted country. But to start a process that ends up with 3,000 dead in New York, the demolition of the Twin Towers, you know, that picture where building number 7 comes down, this is not executed by a human being with the qualities of empathy and compassion, where there's a certain level of victory which has gone beyond any kind of human norm. And I'm reminded, do you remember how the ransom note for little John Benet Ramsey is signed off, Jason?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to bring up right now.
Well, yeah, put it up on the screen, and then let the listeners take a look at how the 3-page ransom note is signed off for. Now, this is a little 7-year-old girl. Sorry to be brutal, but she was sodomized, apparently garroted by an expert knot tire, and tasered, and her skull was fractured right around. She was tortured to death, right? Incredible brutality, right? And now look at the way it's signed off, that ransom note.
Victory, SBTC.
What kind of victory is it to torture a 7-year-old girl?
You know, David, there's an article that I saw.
Why haven't Americans said, why haven't Americans looked at that and said, SBTC victory, this is a political crime?
There was a lawsuit recently, John Benet Ramsey's brother, whose name escapes me right now. He's an adult now. This crime took place more than 20 years ago, and some newspaper or some journalist had accused him of the murder, and he's brought, I think, a $750 million defamation suit against them. I mean, how would a 10-year-old boy tie the knot of the string that was used to garrote her? And there's so many unanswered questions here.
And you see, these are typical, from my mind, of you've got a system, an algorithmic-based system that is deploying people who can be drugged up, if you will, like that lysergic acid amide that was invented by Eli Lilly and patented in 1956, which has the values of very useful from the point of view of psychotherapy research, because it elicits characteristic patterns of rage and hallucinations. If you have prisoners like Christine Marcy probably had through Con Air 1 million prisoners moving in and out of the prison system, over whom she had total control because she's credited with the invention or the launch of a prisoner medical services program. So these people can go into a crime scene like the John Benet Ramsey crime scene, but their ability to exercise empathy or compassion for the little girl is gone. Someone has been told to write this letter. And for me, the John Benet Ramsey murder may very well be the more important murder than the one of JFK, because the message was sent to the father and his employers, which were Lockheed Martin, that we can get any one of your family and exhibit or inflict the greatest cruelty on them and ultimately, neutralize their carbon footprint, and you can't stop us. So that's an unsolved crime, but I think we can solve it. I think SBTC stands for Sigma Beta Tau Colony at the University of Colorado in Boulder, but that's by the by. What I think is, I think now I hope I've covered enough of the background to the idea that if you capture the patent office, right, you capture the country. And well, Serco, not the British, but Serco and its shareholders and its investment banker have captured the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And in my opinion, that's the plug if you want to drain the swamp. Get Serco out of every government department in the United States, including the National Visa Center. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah.
Right? Serco would have brought in the Al-Qaeda or bin Laden sleeper cells.
David, perhaps it's worthwhile for us to review this brief conversation with Wilbur Ross, just because it's so short and so important. Shall I play it?
Yes, absolutely.
Crowdsource the truth, and I was really interested to hear your comments about the 10 millionth patent, I think you said was signed, and increasing. So what can you say about the British company Serco's control of the U.S. Patent Office? Is that a factor at all?
The U.S. Patent Office is a U.S. government agency. It manages itself, and it has been doing a very good job influencing other governments to adopt a similar system. part of the problem with the developing countries, they don't really understand patent law, they don't understand how to do it. So our patent office has been helping them.
Right. But
we just got a minute if you want to ask about space. Otherwise, we're in a hurry.
well, it's mostly the patents and everything to do with this company, Serco. On their website, they say they control the U.S. Patent Office. Is that not true?
I don't want to talk about Serco. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I want to talk about space.
So that's really the telling moment there, David, where he specifically says he doesn't want to talk about Serco. I also picked up, I'm glad we just watched that again, because the moment I asked him, he sort of, you know, he pauses for a second. And I think that psychologists would tell us that when someone utters, it's a sort of a subconscious mechanism of buying time when you're not quite ready to speak. You're thinking, this guy just asked me about something that I specifically don't want to talk about. And it seems like he's doing that. So it's interesting, David, this concept of, and again, I'm glad that we have gone over it again. Sometimes these things bear repeating, and sometimes they take a lot of thought to fully absorb. So we see a clear background where the British have determined that the Patent Office is the repository for future technologies, inventions, including weapons. This example that you've given us of Dr. Thornton wanting to possess the patent of the horizontally loadable rifle or shotgun or whatever obviously had huge implications for the future of warfare. If the state of the art at the time required someone to stand up and put themselves in a vulnerable position while retaliating against an enemy, the technology that this guy wanted to patent would revolutionize warfare, much in the same way that some of these space-based technologies may in fact revolutionize warfare moving forward. So it's kind of odd that Wilbur Ross didn't want to talk about it, particularly given that his whole entire conversation there at the Student Action Summit at Turning Point USA was all about patents. Now, before we move on to how these technologies might play a role in future warfare and in certain things we've seen curious examples of in the recent past, I just wanted to talk about this Serco IPO for a minute because I've been having a really tough time finding details on it. I just Googled Serco IPO and we've got a couple things to look at here. It looks like Crunchbase thinks Serco went public in 1999. Is that correct?
No, there was a management buyout in 1987, and the company then was called RCAGB 1929. That is to say, it was set up in 1929 as a subsidiary, a wholly owned subsidiary of Radio Corporation of America, which became a huge enterprise, of course, led by David Sarnoff. And you can actually Google Marconi and Sarnoff, and you'll find pictures of these two guys going on holiday together with their wives, right? Now, Marconi demonstrated the wireless telegraph at Toynbee Hall in 1899. Toynbee Hall was the role model for Hull House in Chicago. Essentially what you have is RCAGB was a master of radio-based technologies in the run-up to the Second World War. And when the Tizard mission was sent, I believe, not so much by Churchill, but Victor Rothschild to the United States, because the production capability of the British was being degraded by the Luftwaffe bombing, what happened with the Tizard mission is they transferred the technology of the cavity magnetron, the proximity fuse, friend or foe identification, I think calculations for the plutonium bomb, to the Americans on the understanding that any time the Brits needed access to a patent, they could have it. Meanwhile, the Americans could start producing some of these technologies at vast profit. And one of the indicators for me of the use of some of these technologies was in the attack on the North Tower, where you can see a bright white flash just before the plane or the weapons platform goes into the building. And I believe that was a proximity fuse setting off explosives being carried by the weapons platform and inside the building, right? So I think this it's absolutely critical to understand the continuity, or sometimes I think of it as the DNA of these ideas, that something that is invented in, let's say, the 1840s or 50s may be using inventions that were stolen from the American Patent Office after the fire of 1836. They set up what I believe was known as the imperial brain in the instrument room of the General Post Office, where all the cable telegraphs came in, and there were maybe 200 or 300 young women who were transcribing the telegraph signals into the messages that then the telegraph boys would run to the home of an aristocrat and deliver some inside information that would make the aristocrat even richer than he already was, if you see my drift. But anyway, the nickname apparently, and that seems to be being expurgated, for the instrument room of the General Post Office in the 1840s and 50s was the imperial brain. And my argument is the imperial brain has morphed through adopting new technologies like the wireless telegraph or the internet, right through to kinetics, social engineering protection appliance. And the imperial brain is with us today. It's actually more powerful than ever, and it's less understood than ever. That is to say, your average politician, which should be listening to our show, paying attention, because, you know, Trump ought to be looking very carefully at Wilbur Ross, because I think Wilbur Ross is looking very carefully at Trump to the extent that he's going to do what he promised to do, or may have promised to do, in 1990, when his creditors were thinking about sending him in bankrupt. But Wilbur Ross negotiated a deal where they rolled the debts over, maybe to collect at a future date when and if Trump became president. Over to you.
Huh. Yeah, it's very interesting. You know, I'm as you speak, David, I'm constantly Googling around to try to keep up with some of the topics that you're raising. I'm very curious as to why Donald Trump would have Wilbur Ross be his commerce secretary. I mean, sure, he's probably repaying a favor or whatever it is, but the thing that I find so curious about Wilbur Ross's position in the Donald Trump cabinet is that there are a lot of articles, if you Google around, questioning the integrity of businesses related to Wilbur Ross. He's been accused of grifting. And there was this article in Forbes that we had looked at one time, which raised a lot of questions. You know, there was something in the Paradise Papers or the Panama Papers that were linking Wilbur Ross to a particular Russian company. And when I think about the aggressive nature of the way that Robert Mueller has gone after everyone and anyone who knows Donald Trump. I guess this wasn't the article that was talking about it, but I'm just very curious as to why Wilbur Ross hasn't fallen under the microscope of Robert Mueller if Russian collusion is what they're looking for. Here's a guy, he's been connected to Trump for years, he's doing business in Russia, he's the commerce secretary. If there's a link, why isn't Wilbur Ross one of the guys being investigated? We know that tomorrow, Dr. Jerome Corsi will begin his legal case against Robert Mueller. And all of these topics that you're talking about, David, radio technologies, patents, microwave technologies, the kinetic social engineering protection appliance, they all seem to relate in some way to an individual who's brought a lawsuit against me. Well, a group of individuals actually who have essentially failed in Virginia, had their case kicked out of South Carolina, were put under a court's order to show cause in New York, and are within days of very likely getting federal sanctions. And it seems that they become very active when you and I talk about things related to this. So to boil down your hypothesis to its most essential core, the patent office is the seat of control, because if you control technology, you can do all this stuff.
Yes, and there's a concept known as Crown Rights Rules, and maybe we should talk about, you know, as you got in the title, the deaths of the Risk Waters group people.
Yes.
Up in the windows of the World Restaurant, and the connection to the California fires.
Yes.
Now, at first blush, people would say, well, you know, what are you talking about? They're separated by 18 years and 1,000 miles or whatever at different times. But then we should start getting in the habit and helping people, lay people who are not physicists or engineers or scientists or whatever, understand that the signature of these crime scenes, it suggests that there is a common element in them. Now, in both crime scenes, let's take the Windows of the World restaurant. That was hosting or having a meeting, a breakfast meeting of the Risk Waters Group, which is a British group that does publications and analysis of insurance risks, presumably things like catastrophe bonds and that sort of thing. And they were meeting at the Windows of the World restaurant. I think the first speaker was scheduled to start at 9 o'clock, but there was a breakfast beforehand. And I think there were about 70 high flyers in the New York financial, insurance, and banking community, people from Salomon Smith Barney and that sort of thing. They were invited. And there was one, Christopher Hyman, who was the chief executive officer of Serco at that meeting. Well, anyway, he left the meeting, I would estimate at about 8:40, right? The plane hit at 8:46:46, according to the Goldman Sachs servers. And he gets in the elevator and goes down to address a meeting of Serco shareholders. Now, Serco, as we know, was the IPO was structured, I believe, well, I know it was by N.M. Rothschild, but I believe specifically it was Wilbur Ross. So that Serco meeting of shareholders, if you look at the shareholders of Serco, it's the most odd arrangement of anything other than what I would call an imperial trust, because it's got three sovereign governments and their funds, the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of Singapore, and the government of the United Kingdom and its funds. And then you would have what I would describe as the elite intellectual pension funds. In the United States, that's the teachers, TIAA, CREF, I think they've dropped the CREF part of it. TIAA stands for Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, which I believe is the largest private pension fund in the world, and that would pay the benefits to the likes of Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, the former intellectual property lawyer with Sidley Austin, Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton, the former intellectual property lawyer with Rose Law. Right? So, and then you have the state of California and its funds, which presumably is an investor or a stakeholder in PG&E, which apparently in the latest news may be sued for murder or some associated crime on the basis if they were maliciously negligent in the maintenance of their equipment. Right? So now Chris Hyman goes down to the 47th floor where there's a group of people that might have a vested interest in neutralizing the carbon footprint of their enemy. Now, what is the enemy? What is Serco's enemy? Well, it's kind of interesting. I guess it's any company, individual, or corporation that might blow the whistle on its Patentstein network, which is control of sovereign states through the patent office, where the sovereign state can be induced to pay protection money to avoid having its carbon footprint neutralized. Now, if people think I'm being fanciful, they can look up CFPH, Security and Carbon Credit System, which is a patent. And in the wording of that patent, it talks about how to help a trust balance off its investment in securities, which might include Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, or EADS, with companies that can provide a carbon credit. The argument being amongst these tiny minds, they're not the sharpest knife in the drawer, is that if carbon dioxide is the main driver of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, yeah, that's good. Thank you very much, yeah. Catastrophic anthropogenic warming, then they can only ethically administer the trust if they buy in carbon credits to neutralize the carbon, or partly neutralize the carbon footprint of the investee company, which might be Boeing, or it might be PG&E, or it might be Risk Waters. So what I'm saying is the MO, or the mens rea of the activities that we saw on 911 that killed those people in the Windows of the World restaurant, and the mens rea of the fires in California that have killed, I don't know, it's still some debate about how many people have died, is more about neutralizing their carbon footprint and sending a message to their loved ones and their communities that the most important thing in the world, of course it's a hoax on a scale that's way beyond the Dutch tulip bulbs, that the greatest threat to the survival of the planet is this inoffensive trace gas, carbon dioxide. Over to you.
Well, it's interesting, David, because this is something that people talk about all the time, and it's one of these issues where if you question it at all, they just don't even want to debate. There's so many different news outlets that have come out and said that there's just no place for so-called climate deniers on their media outlet. I forget who it was that said it most recently, but you know, it's interesting to see how these things work. So we put in no place for climate deniers. First thing they do is they label the offending party. Either it's a conspiracy theorist or a climate denier. Someone comes forward with science that says, hey, carbon dioxide is the leading driver of anthropogenic global warming. And some other scientist evaluates that statement and says, well, it's correct or it's incorrect. Any scientific research worth anything undergoes peer review. So other scientists would review it, and you build a body of peer-reviewed information and determine if it's correct or incorrect. Here, these guys are saying, you know, first of all, if you don't agree, you're a climate denier, which doesn't make any sense because denying that there's a climate is obviously false. We have a climate. It's just a question of, do you deny this notion that carbon dioxide is harmful to the climate? And look at all these articles. Huffington Post, no place for climate deniers to hide. Schneiderman says climate deniers have no place. From the Climate Depot, no more BBC platform for climate change deniers. So anyone who wants to question this, and look, this is all within the last couple of years, this is from 2018, 2017, all when President Trump was president. And of course, he has famously said that climate change is a hoax created by the Chinese. And Trump, in many ways, you know, David, I think Trump does have a particular genius, because I think what happens is there are people who possess a degree of genius in whatever area in which they have it, and then they'll say something and someone who doesn't understand will just immediately think it's crazy. And I have had a similar experience with you. You say things that are so outrageous that the immediate response is, this must be wrong or crazy. But when you start to dive into it and understand the history of the Patent Office, how it was the only building not destroyed when the British burned down most of Washington, D.C., how Thornton worked that scam to get his name on the patent, how Serco controls the Patent Office, and Wilbur Ross doesn't even want to have a discussion, even though he's just given a whole speech about how important patents are and how he wants the U.S. Patent Office model to now be used in other developing countries, because I guess he realizes that you give some child in China or Taiwan or somewhere in Africa a computer, and perhaps they might be the next person to invent something amazing. You know, you talk about the cavity magnetron stolen on the Tizard mission. That's one of these technologies, David, like the integrated circuit, or one of these things that so many future technologies are based on. Of course, we would have no radar without the cavity magnetron. We would have no microwave ovens. We would have no microwave weapons without the cavity magnetron. So let's transition for a moment to that, how this 70-year-old technology, almost 80-year-old technology is still super relevant today, and how it could be being used in some of these technologies that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a term, I think, MMIC. I think that's monolithic microwave integrated circuit, right? And one of the companies that has pioneered high-powered microwave transmission, well, pioneered, I mean, it's a fairly old technology, as you just point out, because it's go back to the cavity magnetron, is an outfit called Nanowave in Ottawa, in Canada. And Nanowave is working with Maxar Technologies and presumably Joanne Isham on the spot wave or spot wave focusing for communications purposes. Now, I visualize this, or I see this Maxar Technologies as a fascinating company for the crimes of 911 and the crimes in California with the fires, because prior to being called Maxar Technologies, it was called McDonald Detweiler and Associates. And I met John McDonald in 1995 in his office because I wanted to discuss with him the possibility of the company that had worked with me on my pioneering artificial intelligence work, Rakel Defense Electronics, buying McDonald Detweiler and Associates, because I saw some of the technologies would be useful in the development of AI applications in the oil industry. Anyway, he wouldn't look me in the eye, which I found strange. And that same year, McDonald Detweiler and Associates was sold to Orbital Sciences of Dulles, Virginia. Now, McDonald Detweiler had developed some really interesting technologies, one being the mobile radio data systems, effectively for the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP. And it was the first mobile radio data systems, I believe, to be used by the police and emergency responders. And they were particularly interested in using it to do criminal background checks. So you stop some man driving a Lamborghini in New York and say, we don't think you can afford that Lamborghini, and they've used da-da-da-da-da. And they do a background check. They find the guy has a pretty dodgy background. Might be a talk show host, eh, Jason? I'm sure you don't own a Lamborghini. But then they confiscate it because they don't believe you can prove that you didn't use dirty money to buy it, and then you have to sue the government to get it back. So McDonald Detweiler pioneered mobile radio data systems to do background checks on criminals. And of course, what you get there is you can identify where the police are and where the criminal is. And if you know where the police are, you can avoid the police. And if you know where the criminal is, you can arrest them if you're so minded, right? Flip it over, right? And you can end up by mobilizing what I call Con Air SWAT teams, you know, from recruited through Christine Masters' prisons transport system. And you can mobilize these people into a crime scene before the crime occurs. You identify where the friendly or the enemy police are. You avoid the police. You go into the crime scene. You blow up the buildings. You extract them, put them back in jail with a perfect alibi, right?
Right.
So McDonald Detweiler has some amazing technology. And on May the 3rd of 2001, they announced that they've been awarded an instrument approach procedure contract by the United States Air Force, where through a drag and drop user interface, you can take a plane off its regular en route airway, avoid obstacles like towers. And I suppose the implication of that press release was we can now prevent hijacking. But as I point out, it depends on where the enemy is. If the enemy is in the cockpit, right, and the friend is on the ground, and you're a criminal group, well, you can blow up the plane. If it's the other way around, a decent and honorable pilot, many of them, incidentally, on 9-1 have military background, as Field said, that there's no way a low-time, whether it's a Muslim or not, could take over the plane that he was flying, because there's a variety of things that he could do. He put the plane in a dive and pins the hijacker to the roof and then hits him over the head with one of those fire axes, right? So this whole story of, you know, low-time Muslim pilots who can barely fly a Cessna, taking these aircraft through the most incredibly complex acrobatic maneuvers is garbage. But let me go over to the MMIC technology of nanowave. So nanowave works with McDonald Detweiler, which is now Maxar Technologies, On the board of directors of Maxar Technologies is Joanne Isham, who was 25 years with the CIA in charge of clandestine operations.
Right.
Well, what do we got here now? We've got a woman who's de facto, sometimes I say ad hoc custody of a patent pool of the kind of devices that have been pooled by McDonnell Detweiler, now Maxar Technologies. She would be perfectly capable of looking through the networks that were assembled by what was called the National Imaging and Mapping Agency down onto a crime site or a prospective crime site in California, and directing a small network of geostationary satellites to focus their microwave beams on the rooftops of houses in paradise. And you would literally create an explosive temperature of sparking inside those buildings, and you could brush out all of the buildings that you decided you wanted to obliterate, and calculate the weight of carbon saved to go into this pool of trust created by Serco. So it's an extraordinary power. It's almost a godlike power, if you will. But when you boil it down to, it's basically the venality of human beings. Some people, they like the power associated with neutralizing carbon footprints. And you know what neutralizing the carbon footprint of someone is a euphemism for, Jason?
Killing them.
You kill them.
Yeah.
Exactly. So now for these people, a mother with a newborn child, or even a fetus that's about to go through the birth canal, is a huge threat to the survival of the planet. I mean, it's beyond absurd. But once you've got yourself, and apparently Christine Marcy has a great phrase that she shared with her brother, Field McConnell, for We the People. She describes them as mindless breeders and useless breathers. How do you like that, Jason?
I don't really care for it, David, but when you talk about these technologies and painting, it immediately brings me to this video that was the subject of discussion on my show the other night with Charles Walton. Can I share this with you for a moment?
Please, please.
So this is an incident that occurred in Kenner, Louisiana on December 27th, as captured by cell phone of a witness. Talk about painting with an electronic brush.
That's microwave.
That's crazy!
So the witness immediately responds by saying that's crazy. He's just witnessed something so unusual. I think that seeing it on video is one thing, seeing it in front of your own eyes is another. My first thought was, well, you know, maybe it is some sort of electrical disturbance moving along the wires, but wouldn't that move so much more quickly? I mean, this goes on for several seconds, if not minutes. And the truly bizarre thing, David, is that it was mirrored by a similar event in New York City the same day, within 12 or 15 hours. That was also captured by a guy on YouTube who goes by Action Kid 105. The most interesting aspect of what was recorded by Action Kid 105 is that this Action Kid 105 lives in Astoria, Queens, where the Con Edison incident occurred. But Action Kid 105 went to the Con Edison plant the following day, and there was like no visible damage. 2 minutes of the entire sky over the sizable area of New York City basically lit up for 2 minutes. I mean, the original video from Action Kid 105 is more than 2 minutes of the sky lighting up green, blue, all kinds of colors. And he then, the next day, travels to the plant. We see no evidence of fire or explosions. And in other videos that I've looked at where, you know, transformers exploded or whatever, it doesn't go on for 2 minutes. It basically happens for a few seconds and then it stops and there's a fire.
Well, I think, you know, that to me looks like microwave transmission, high-power microwave transmission from some point above. It could be an aircraft or it could be a satellite. But that brings me back to the Maxar Technologies development, because I think you've got there a patent pool of devices for controlling space and crime scene investigations on the ground, because when we talk about the array of patents available, these people have access to encryption systems for criminal groups, either in the air or on the ground. So there's a Boeing encryption system, I think they called it, Boeing asymmetric encryption system. And then there's a Motorola system for encrypted radio communications that I believe was available to the people who demolished the towers on 9/11, but not available to the firefighters who were ambushed inside the building. Now, going back to my argument that if they really do have, well, I'm sure they do have control over the patent office, and they're using artificial intelligence and expert system and fuzzy logic algorithms, then what we need to be able to do, and probably simply because of my career experience and having built these systems, I can help people with you look at the world through the eyes of the AI algorithms in the patent office. And I've called it Patentstein because I think we've created a monster. And the first approach that I would take in rectifying this is get Serco out of every government contract in the United States, because it's an existential threat to the Republic. Over to you.
Yeah, one of the other points that you bring up very often, David, is this concept of mens rea. And for people who maybe aren't fully understanding that, you're talking about the guilty mind, that when someone is investigating a crime, there's a guy named Chris Watt who killed his wife and 2 daughters. And there's a number of things we can investigate about his personality, his interaction with his wife, the messages that he sent, and we can evaluate them from a psychological standpoint to determine if this is the guy who went and conducted that insanely evil act. But what you're describing by the artificial intelligence, which is laid out in the Jerome Lemelson patent of prisoner tracking and, what is it called? Prisoner tracking and... Prisoner
and parolee tracking, isn't it?
Something like that. But basically, it uses artificial intelligence algorithms, prisoner tracking, let's look it up. Artificial intelligence algorithms, prisoner tracking and warning system to upgrade and downgrade their privileges based on fuzzy logic and artificial intelligence. So that removes the human factor of making decisions about, has this person done something that is worthy of a reward or punishment, and puts it in the hands of a computer algorithm, eliminating the mens rea. We can't evaluate a decision made by an artificial intelligence algorithm in the same way we can evaluate a decision made by a psychopathic human or a non-psychopathic human. So it's interesting to think that this patent from Lemelson, which was issued in 2000, this prisoner tracking and warning system, corresponding methods to upgrade or downgrade privileges. Well, what would stop someone like Kinetic from using the same expert system, neural networks, artificial intelligence, algorithms, and fuzzy logic to upgrade or downgrade privileges granted to anyone, someone who is participating in some sort of activity, some sort of operation, some sort of plan? And if these plans are carried out by artificial intelligence, there is no mens rea, there is no guilty mind, there is no guilty party. It's a distributed, decentralized way of carrying out criminal activity that makes it particularly difficult to solve, particularly difficult to charge an individual with these crimes. I believe this method is being used in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that is why that year 1988 is so fascinating in the context of the attempt to neutralize the carbon footprint of humanity, if you will. It's a genocidal, depopulationist agenda, because I'm just reading this article of 30 years ago this week, NASA scientist James Hansen testified to Congress that the age of climate change had arrived. The announcement shook the political establishment in 1988. George H.W. Bush, in the middle of a heated presidential campaign, vowed to use the White House effect to battle the greenhouse effect. I mean, now, maybe I'm arrogating more credit for this than I should, but remember, I invented the deductive computing machine, priority date 11/11/1988. James Hansen announces that the age of climate change has arrived and imputes that or attributes that to carbon dioxide. And Serco IPO with these bizarre groups of shareholders, including 10 global custodians with $100 trillion of assets under management, is launched probably by NM Rothschild's Wilbur Ross. So what I'm suggesting, inviting the audience, and I hope they can jump on board, because, you know, I think you and I sometimes think we're in a bit of a lonely furrow, whereas I want to activate the injured community, the people who've suffered because their relatives have been killed or whatever in these events, to join your Patreon account and my Patreon account and help us develop an antidote to what I call the custodians. That is to say, I believe what we need now are witnesses of good intent to come onto the show and tell us what they saw in respect of the mass casualty event suffered by the Risk Waters Group in the Windows of the World restaurant on 911, or the mass casualty event, even if it's distributed around those California fires area, because I think we can help them. It's not appropriate to try and accuse anyone of murder one with these AI algorithms in the loop, but I believe we can help them put a very convincing case for wrongful deaths, damages associated with wrongful deaths linked to the negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of patented devices in the hands of their custodians. So it's not the owner, just like I guess I'm the owner in some sense of the intellectual property described in the deductive computing machine, but I'm no longer the custodian of devices that actually implement that, which I believe has now been transported into the patent office and is now being programmed to help to neutralize the carbon footprints of securities by forcing their managers or their investors to buy carbon credits from Serco. Over to you.
And David, you know, I really want to thank you for bringing my attention to this Chicago Climate Exchange. It's an aspect of the global warming debate that I was totally unaware of. And I think when people learn that Al Gore and Richard Sandor created that exchange, it sheds a whole new light on Al Gore's enthusiastic activities in the climate change debate. I think it calls them into question if he's got direct financial gain. This article from 1988 about a sharp cut in the burning of fossil fuels is urged to battle a shift in climate. It sort of reeks of a plan being set into motion, utilizing the New York Times, which certainly in 1988 was highly respected. I don't think as many people in 1988 would question the integrity or the motives of the New York Times as they would today. But the idea that George H.W. Bush as president cares about the climate at all is totally disputed by his activities in Iraq in the first Gulf War, utilizing, as you've described, all kinds of chemical weapons. They were aware that there was anthrax there. They dropped depleted uranium weapons on Iraq and other nations in the region, which of course are banned chemical weapons. I was reviewing a video about some of the different weapons bans over the years, biological and chemical weapons. It's alarming to see how few of those coalitions include the United States. The United States remains outside of some of those treaties and continues to use these weapons that have far worse impact on the environment than carbon dioxide possibly could. So that's absurd. I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank you, David, for bringing up Patreon. There's been a huge controversy with Patreon and their apparent blatant disrespect for the First Amendment by removing Sargon of Akkad, a British blogger named Carl Benjamin, as well as Milo Yiannopoulos and a couple of outspoken individuals for what they decide is hate speech. Now, obviously, we reject the notion that someone should be deprived of their ability to earn a living because we disagree with their ideas or their choice of words. It flies in the face of the notion of freedom of speech, but you've introduced the intriguing possibility that perhaps Patreon doesn't want to do this. Perhaps Patreon wants to do the right thing, but they're being forced by some outside influence, and that very possibly could be the very payment processors that Patreon relies upon to receive money from our viewers and to send it to us. They're essentially a middleman and very vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack. But people can still support you, David, and I hope they will, by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. And it's very important here in the beginning of 2019 that our viewers do support the show. Hopefully people will still go to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth and sponsor this program. David, I'm looking for a number of different alternatives, but this is a complex array of companies that are involved. So it's not simply a matter of leaving Patreon and going somewhere else, because Subscribestar, which I've been actively communicating with, relies on the very same global payment network, and they have been having some difficulties finding alternatives to receiving and providing payments. So we're in a very dangerous time if the corporations that control the banks, control the credit cards, control the ways that we all interface with our money, can exert their political opinions and ideologies on the mechanisms that we're relying on for information.
And if I may just interject there, with the anthrax attacks, where there was anthrax bacilli mixed with sabotage spore powder mailed to various targets, they were mailed to Senate leaders and media leaders. So going back to that point, I think the technique that you and I are developing, and I would like as many witnesses, if you will, to join our 2 Patreon accounts, because what I think we can do there is we can build momentum amongst the witnesses and informed people within the injured community that will outweigh or bypass any restriction they placed on us online. Just to sort of in closing from my point of view, when I was at Cambridge, I was awarded a scholarship for outstanding academic performance in applied mathematics and thermodynamics. And people say, well, what the hell is thermodynamics? I'm saying, well, it's the science of hot air, waste, and chaos, which is a great metaphor for dealing with politicians, I think. So what I can convey, even though I'm much longer in the tooth and I've got some pretty odd teeth, what I can share with the listeners and yourself is an appetite for removing the complexity from that, but just look at Wilbur Ross in terms of hot air, waste, and chaos, right? Should he be in charge of the Commerce Department, and should he have any kind of custodial authority over the United States Patent and Trademark Office, where danger lurks in the form of Patentstein AI trademarked? Over to you.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions about Wilbur Ross and many that I wanted to ask him, but they wouldn't allow me to do it. There were some articles that I was Googling through where people are questioning if Donald Trump will remove Wilbur Ross, but I have a feeling those people aren't necessarily watching our show here and may not understand the complexities of the relationship between Donald Trump and Wilbur Ross. I have a feeling there's a very good reason why Wilbur Ross is there, and it may or may not be that he is the best possible choice for Commerce Secretary, but rather he could be someone who's there to make sure Donald Trump does or does not do certain things that certain people may want to see done. David, I want to thank you for joining me.
Yeah, and Ron Brown was Commerce Secretary, and he ended up with a bullet in the back of his head, apparently.
That's right, and someone else has brought to my attention that Ron Brown, before being Commerce Secretary, was at the same law firm as Hale Boggs, who was the senator who was the first guy on the Warren Commission to question the results. So, I mean, I'm not a statistician, David, but what are the odds that two lawyers from the same law firm would both die in plane crashes?
Well, being a lawyer is pretty dangerous, and being in a plane with these patented devices that can take you out of the air and fly you through maneuvers with a drag and drop user interface, courtesy of Maxar Technologies, I think that doubles the danger.
Absolutely. David, thank you for joining me. I'll see you again on Friday. I hope that people will join us on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I will be back tonight at 5 p.m. with Charles Ortel. He'll be closing in. Thank you, David, and thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you, Jason. Bye now.